The crowd, outside a luxury charity event in Lagos, burst into laughter when a little girl suddenly pointed across the street. "Dad, that's my brother." 8-year-old Adora Ugwu stood beside her father, billionaire tech magnate, Theophilus Ugwu. Her small finger aimed at a skinny teenage boy, pushing a rusted garbage cart. The boy froze. His clothes were stained with dirt. His hands smelled of trash, but his eyes looked painfully familiar. The laughter slowly faded as Theophilus turned pale. Because the name written on the boy's worn school badge, Chibuzor Okafor, was the same surname as the woman he once loved, the woman he believed had disappeared 14 years ago. And suddenly the past he buried might be standing in the street holding a trash bag.
Before we continue this story, tell me in the comments, what country are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? And if stories about truth, justice, and unexpected family touch your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.
The city of Lagos rarely slept. Even before sunrise, the streets were already alive with the sound of engines, traders shouting across roadside stalls, and the distant roar of buses fighting through endless traffic. Skyscrapers glimmered above the morning haze, symbols of ambition, rising from a city where fortunes could be built or destroyed in a single generation. At the center of that world stood one name everyone recognized: Theophilus Ugwu. By the age of 42, Theophilus had become one of the most respected technology entrepreneurs in Nigeria. His company, Ugwu Dynamics, had transformed digital infrastructure across West Africa. Government officials consulted him. International investors admired him. Magazines regularly listed him among the continent's most influential business leaders. But the public version of Theophilus Ugwu was only part of the truth. Behind the headlines and polished interviews was a man who lived a far quieter life than most people imagined. His mansion stood on the peaceful edge of Ikoyi, surrounded by tall palm trees and iron gates guarded day and night. The house itself was enormous, white stone walls, wide glass windows, a garden large enough to host charity galas. Yet inside, the atmosphere felt strangely calm, almost too calm. Because the house was not filled with the noise of a large family. It belonged to just two people, Theophilus and his daughter, 8-year-old Adora Ugwu. That morning, Adora sat cross-legged on the kitchen counter, swinging her feet while the housekeeper prepared breakfast. Her hair was neatly braided with tiny gold beads that clicked softly when she moved. "Daddy," she said suddenly. Theophilus looked up from his tablet, where he had been reviewing a contract proposal. "Yes," Ada, she tilted her head thoughtfully. "Why do some people have brothers and sisters, but I don't?" The question hung in the air longer than expected. The housekeeper quietly pretended not to hear. Theophilus placed the tablet down slowly. Adora was not asking for the first time. Children were curious by nature, and Adora's school was full of large families. She often came home telling stories about classmates with 2 brothers, 3 sisters, cousins who lived in the same house. But each time she asked, Theophilus gave the same gentle answer. "Every family is different," he said softly. Adora considered this. "But wouldn't it be fun," she continued, "someone to play with all the time?" Theophilus smiled faintly. "You already have many friends." "That's not the same," she said with the serious logic of a child. For a moment he didn't respond, because the truth was, he didn't know how to answer. Adora slid off the counter and ran toward the dining table, already distracted by a bowl of fruit. Theophilus watched her quietly. Sometimes he wondered if the quiet in the house was a blessing or a punishment. His wife, Amaka, had died 5 years earlier, after a sudden illness. Since then, raising Adora had become the center of his world. Every business trip, every major decision, every late-night meeting was arranged around one simple priority: his daughter. Yet even with that love, there was a corner of his life he had locked away so completely that he rarely allowed himself to think about it. A past that felt like another lifetime. Theophilus stood and walked toward the large window overlooking the garden. Outside, the morning sun was beginning to burn through the clouds. Somewhere deep in his mind, a memory flickered briefly. A young woman laughing, dark eyes full of stubborn fire. But the memory vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. He pushed it away, just as he had done for years. There was too much work to do today. Across the city, in a place far removed from the quiet streets of Ikoyi, another morning had begun very differently. In Ajagun, one of Lagos's most crowded neighborhoods, narrow alleys twisted between rows of small houses, built from cement blocks and rusted metal sheets. Here, the air carried a mixture of cooking smoke, sea wind, and the constant movement of people struggling to make a living. Inside a tiny two-room home, Chibuzor Okafor was already awake. The 13-year-old boy moved quietly so he would not disturb the old woman sleeping on the mattress beside the wall. His grandmother, Mama Enkem, had been coughing through most of the night again. Chibuzor carefully poured water into a metal cup and placed it beside her bed before stepping outside. The morning air was cool, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. He wore the same school uniform he had washed the night before. It was faded and slightly too small now, but it was clean. Clean mattered, even if the rest of the world didn't always notice. Outside the door leaned a battered handcart made from old bicycle wheels and wooden boards. Several empty sacks were tied neatly to its side. Chibuzor checked them carefully. Plastic bottles, metal cans, anything recyclable. The boy worked quickly, but methodically. After school each day, he collected waste from streets and dumpsters, then sold the materials to a recycling depot near the harbor. The money paid for food and medicine, especially medicine. From inside the house, Mama Enkem's voice called weakly, "Chibuzor, are you leaving already?" He stepped back inside immediately. The old woman had pushed herself up against the wall, wrapped in a faded blanket. "You should rest," he said gently. She shook her head. "You have school. I'll go soon." Her eyes softened as she studied him. "You work too hard for a boy your age." Chibuzor smiled faintly. "It's not hard." Both of them knew that wasn't true, but neither of them said it aloud. Mama Enkem reached for his hand. "You remind me of your mother," she murmured. At the mention of the word, Chibuzor grew quiet. His mother had died when he was very young. Most of his memories were blurred fragments, her singing while cooking, the smell of soap, the feeling of being lifted into the air. But one thing had always remained clear. His mother had loved him deeply. "Did she work this hard too?" he asked. Mama Enkem hesitated. "Yes," she said slowly. "She did." Then she looked away, because there were other things she remembered about her daughter's life, things she had never told Chibuzor, things that still lived like shadows inside her mind. But some truths she believed could break a young heart before it was ready. So she said nothing more. Chibuzor squeezed her hand. "I'll bring medicine this evening," he promised. She nodded, though both of them knew the medicine cost more than he usually earned in a day. Still, promises mattered, even small ones. A few minutes later, Chibuzor pushed the cart out into the narrow street. Neighbors were already beginning their day. A woman frying a kara waved at him. "Good morning, Chibuzor, morning, auntie." He pushed the cart forward, wheels rattling against the uneven road. Some people in the neighborhood respected him, others pitied him. But beyond Ajagun, the world often saw something different. At school, a group of boys passed him in the corridor and laughed loudly. "Careful," one said mockingly. "Don't stand too close or you'll smell like the garbage yard." Chibuzor kept walking. He had learned long ago that silence was stronger than anger. Inside the classroom, however, things were different. When the mathematics teacher wrote a complicated equation on the board, it was Chibuzor who raised his hand first, and it was Chibuzor who solved it correctly. The teacher nodded approvingly. "You have a sharp mind," he said. "Don't waste it." Chibuzor simply returned to his seat. Outside the classroom window, Lagos stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond those buildings lived people whose lives were unimaginably different from his. People who never worried about school fees, or medicine, or how to turn trash into money. But Chibuzor did not envy them. He had something else, a quiet determination, and a promise to the only family he had left. That promise pushed him forward every single day, even if the world barely noticed. What Chibuzor could not possibly know that morning was that somewhere across Lagos, a man named Theophilus Ugwu was about to step into his life. And when their paths finally crossed, neither of their worlds would ever be the same again. The morning bell rang sharply across the courtyard of Ajagun Community Secondary School, and students poured out of their classrooms in a noisy wave of chatter, laughter, and restless energy. For most of them, lunchtime meant a break from lessons, a chance to buy fried snacks from the women selling food outside the school gate. For Chibuzor Okafor, lunchtime meant something else entirely. He slipped his worn backpack over his shoulder and quietly walked past the groups of students heading toward the stalls. Instead, he pushed open the side gate of the school and wheeled out the small wooden cart he had hidden behind the wall. The cart creaked loudly as it rolled across the dirt road. Chibuzor didn't mind the noise. The sound had become part of his life, like the distant hum of generators or the shouting of traders in the market. He moved quickly down the street, scanning the roadside gutters and overflowing waste bins. Plastic bottles, tin cans, old cardboard, anything that could be sold. Each item dropped into the sack with a soft clatter. The work required patience, and Chibuzor had learned to do it efficiently. In less than 40 minutes, he had already filled half a bag, but not everyone ignored him the way he wished they would. 2 boys from his class passed by on the opposite side of the road. One of them, Sola, nudged his friend and pointed. "Look," he laughed loudly. "The garbage king is working again." The other boy covered his nose dramatically. "Careful," he said. "If the smell follows him back to class, we'll all fail the next exam." Both boys burst into laughter. Chibuzor kept sorting through the pile of bottles. He didn't answer. There had been a time years earlier when insults like that burned inside him, when he felt anger rise in his chest and his hands trembled with the urge to fight. But that was before he understood something important. Most people mocked what they didn't understand. And sometimes, silence was the strongest reply. He tied the sack closed and lifted it onto the cart. The metal wheels groaned as he pushed forward again. The recycling depot was about a 15-minute walk away near the harbor where old cargo ships lined the water. By the time he arrived, sweat had already soaked through the back of his school shirt. The depot manager, a thick-shouldered man named Mr. Ibrahim, sat behind a wooden desk, counting bundles of plastic. He looked up as Chibuzor entered. "You again," he said gruffly. Chibuzor nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir." Mr. Ibrahim stood and inspected the bag. He weighed the materials on a rusted scale. "Good collection today." He scribbled a number onto a scrap of paper. Then he counted out several worn banknotes and handed them over. Chibuzor took the money carefully. "Thank you, sir. Schoolboy like you shouldn't be doing this work," Mr. Ibrahim muttered, though his tone was not unkind. Chibuzor gave a small smile. "It's honest work." Mr. Ibrahim studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "Yes, it is." By the time Chibuzor returned to school, the afternoon classes had already begun. He slipped into the classroom quietly. The mathematics teacher barely glanced up, but some of the students noticed. Sola, leaned toward his deskmate and whispered loudly enough for several people to hear. "Careful, everyone. The trash collector is back." A few students snickered. Chibuzor ignored them and opened his notebook. Numbers were easier than people. Numbers never judged. When the bell rang at the end of the school day, Chibuzor packed his bag and hurried home. The narrow streets of Ajagun were crowded as always. Vendors shouted prices for roasted corn and fried plantains. Children played football barefoot in the dusty alleys. But Chibuzor walked straight to the small pharmacy near the corner of the main road. The pharmacist, a middle-aged woman named Auntie Bisi, greeted him warmly. "Ah, Chibuzor." He placed the money from the recycling depot onto the counter. "Medicine for Mama Enkem, please." Auntie Bisi counted the notes carefully. Then she sighed. "This is only enough for half the prescription." Chibuzor lowered his eyes slightly. "I know." She hesitated for a moment. Then she quietly reached behind the counter and filled the full prescription bottle anyway. "Take it," she said. Chibuzor looked up surprised. "But you can pay the rest later." He shook his head. "No, Auntie, I will bring the rest tomorrow." The woman studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "All right." Chibuzor took the bottle and thanked her before leaving. The walk home felt longer that evening. The sky had begun to turn orange and the heat of the day was finally fading. Inside the small house, Mama Enkem was sitting up against the wall when he entered. "You came back early today," she said weakly. "I sold more bottles." He handed her the medicine and poured water into the metal cup. She swallowed the pills slowly. Then she looked at him with tired eyes. "You should not carry all this responsibility alone." Chibuzor shrugged lightly. "I'm not alone. I have you." She smiled faintly. "You are still a child." He sat down beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mama Enkem reached toward a small wooden box sitting near the corner of the room. It was old, the wood cracked with age. Inside were only a few belongings: a photograph, a bracelet, and several folded pieces of paper. She lifted the bracelet carefully. It was made from simple woven cord, with a small silver charm attached. "Your mother gave this to you when you were a baby," she said softly. Chibuzor turned it over in his hands. "I don't remember. You were too young." He studied the bracelet quietly. "Did my father ever see it?" he asked suddenly. The question struck the room, like a stone dropped into still water. Mama Enkem froze. For years, Chibuzor had rarely asked about his father. But children grew older, and questions always returned. She forced a calm expression. "Your father," she began slowly. Then she stopped, because the truth was complicated and painful. The man who had loved her daughter once had never known what became of her. But that story carried wounds too deep to explain yet. So instead, Mama Enkem simply said, "He was not part of our lives." Chibuzor nodded slowly. He had expected that answer. Still, something in his chest felt strangely empty. Mama Enkem watched him quietly. Inside her mind, memories stirred. Of a young woman named Epheoma, of letters written late at night, of tears, and of a name she had not spoken aloud in many years. Theophilus Ugwu. But Chibuzor was not ready for that truth yet. Some secrets waited for their own time. Outside, the sounds of Ajagun continued into the evening. Generators hummed. Neighbors laughed. Life moved forward as it always did. And somewhere across the city, in a quiet mansion surrounded by high walls, a man named Theophilus Ugwu was preparing for an event that would unknowingly bring his past crashing into the present. Neither he nor Chibuzor could see it coming, but their lives were already moving toward the same moment. A moment that would change everything. 3 days later, the city of Lagos woke to unusual excitement. Large banners had appeared overnight across several neighborhoods, announcing a new community project organized by Ugwu Dynamics Foundation. The campaign was simple, but ambitious: cleaning, neglected streets, supporting recycling initiatives, and providing resources for poorer districts struggling with waste management. Television crews had already begun setting up cameras. For most people, it was just another charity program, sponsored by a wealthy company. But, for Theophilus Ugwu, the event carried deeper meaning. Standing in front of the mirror inside his Ikoyi home that morning, he adjusted the cuff of his dark suit and studied his own reflection. 42 years old, silver had begun to appear near his temples. Success had etched quiet confidence into his posture. Yet there was something else, behind his eyes, a weariness that success alone could not erase. Behind him, the door burst open. Daddy, 8-year-old Adora, ran into the room, already dressed in a bright yellow dress decorated with small sunflowers. "You said I could come with you today." Theophilus turned and smiled. "Yes, I did." She spun in a circle. "Are there going to be cameras?" "Probably. And reporters, most likely." Adora nodded thoughtfully. "Then I need to behave like a very important person." Theophilus laughed softly. "You already are." Adora skipped toward the door but stopped suddenly. "Daddy, yes, will there be other children there?" "Maybe." Her eyes lit up. "Good." Because Adora Ugwu loved meeting new people. Unlike her father, she had none of the emotional walls that wealth and responsibility often built around adults. To her, the world was still simple. People were either kind or unkind, friends or strangers, nothing in between. By mid-morning, the Foundation convoy had arrived in Ajagun. Black SUVs rolled slowly through the narrow streets, drawing curious crowds. For many residents, the sight of such expensive vehicles entering their neighborhood was unusual. Some watched with excitement, others watched with suspicion. Charity sometimes came with hidden motives. When Theophilus Ugwu stepped out of the first vehicle, cameras immediately turned toward him. Reporters began shouting questions. "Mr. Ugwu, what inspired this project? How long will the program run? Will the foundation expand it nationwide?" Theophilus answered calmly, his voice steady and practiced. "Every city deserves dignity," he said into the microphones. Clean streets are not only about sanitation, they are about respect for communities that have often been overlooked. Applause rippled through the gathered crowd. Nearby, Adora stepped out of the car holding the hand of her nanny. Her eyes moved everywhere at once. The neighborhood looked completely different from the quiet streets of Ikoyi. Children ran barefoot through the dusty road. Women sold fruit from wooden stalls. Music played from somewhere in the distance. Adora smiled. To her, the place felt alive. Volunteers from the foundation began distributing gloves and recycling bags to residents participating in the cleanup. Some reporters followed Theophilus as he walked through the street inspecting the program. But Adora had already wandered a few steps away. Her attention had been caught by something else. At the far end of the road, a teenage boy pushed a small wooden cart loaded with sacks. The wheels rattled loudly as they rolled over the uneven ground. Adora watched with curiosity. The boy's clothes were worn and dusty. His hands were covered with dirt from sorting through piles of recyclable waste. Yet something about him made Adora pause. Maybe it was the way he moved carefully, almost protectively, as if the cart carried something valuable instead of trash. Or maybe it was something she could not explain. The boy stopped near a large dumpster and began sorting bottles into separate sacks. Adora walked a few steps closer. The nanny followed cautiously. Meanwhile, across the street, Theophilus had just finished answering a question from a journalist. He turned slightly to look for his daughter. And that was when it happened. Adora suddenly stopped walking, her eyes fixed on something, on the boy, more precisely on the boy's wrist. There, wrapped around the thin skin of his arm, was a woven bracelet with a small silver charm. Adora felt a strange jolt of recognition. She had seen that bracelet before. Not here, not on this street, but somewhere else. Her mind searched quickly. Then she remembered. Several months earlier, she had opened a drawer in her father's study while looking for colored pencils. Inside the drawer had been old photographs and a small broken bracelet that looked exactly the same. She had asked her father about it, but he had closed the drawer quickly and said only, "Just something from long ago." Now standing in the middle of a crowded street in Ajagun, Adora, stared at the bracelet again. It was identical. The same woven cord, the same silver charm. Her heart began beating faster with the excited certainty that only children possessed. She turned and looked across the road. Her father stood there speaking to reporters. Adora lifted her arm and pointed. "Daddy!" Her voice carried across the crowd. Several people turned. Theophilus looked up immediately. "Yes, Ada." Then she said the words that would freeze the entire moment in time. "Dad, that's my brother." For half a second, nobody reacted. Then a few reporters laughed. Someone in the crowd chuckled. But the laughter faded quickly, because the expression on Theophilus Ugwu's face had changed completely. The confident businessman who had faced global investors without hesitation suddenly looked as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. His eyes moved slowly toward the boy beside the garbage cart. At that exact moment, Chibuzor also looked up. Their eyes met across the street. For Chibuzor, the man in the expensive suit was just another rich visitor who had come to the neighborhood with cameras. But something about the way the man stared at him felt strange, almost familiar. For Theophilus, the sensation was far more powerful. Because the moment he saw the boy's face, clearly, something inside his chest tightened. The shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw, even the quiet seriousness in the boy's expression. It struck him like an echo from another life. And then his gaze fell to the bracelet. The silver charm glinted under the sunlight. A memory surged forward without warning. A young woman laughing under a university tree. Her voice teasing him as she tied the bracelet around his wrist. This way she had said softly, "You will never forget me." Her name returned to him, like a whisper from the past. Epheoma. Theophilus felt the blood drain from his face. Across the road, Adora still pointed excitedly. "Daddy, look." But Theophilus couldn't move, because suddenly the past he had buried 14 years earlier no longer felt distant. It was standing 20 meters away, holding a garbage cart, and looking directly at him. For several seconds after Adora's words rang through the street, time seemed to slow. The laughter from the reporters faded into uneasy silence. Even the nearby volunteers paused in the middle of their work, sensing the sudden tension that had spread across the road. 8-year-old Adora still stood with her arm raised, her finger pointing directly at the boy beside the garbage cart. To her, the statement had been simple, obvious. Children rarely doubted their instincts, but to the adults around her, the moment had become deeply uncomfortable. One of the reporters chuckled nervously. "Kids say the funniest things," he muttered to the cameraman. Yet the cameraman wasn't laughing, because Theophilus Ugwu had not moved. The billionaire businessman who usually handled every public situation with calm control now looked as if he had forgotten how to breathe. His gaze remained locked on the boy across the street. Chibuzor Okafor. The boy stood motionless, one hand resting on the wooden handle of the cart. He had heard the girl's words clearly. "Dad, that's my brother." For a brief moment, confusion crossed his face. Then embarrassment. People in the crowd had started whispering. A few even laughed openly. Chibuzor lowered his eyes and turned slightly, pretending to focus again on the sack of plastic bottles beside him. He had experienced humiliation before. This would simply be another one. Across the road, Adora frowned. She did not understand why everyone was suddenly quiet. She tugged on her father's sleeve. Daddy Theophilus blinked. The world rushed back into focus. He became aware again of the cameras pointed toward him, the reporters waiting, the curious faces of the neighborhood residents. He forced a smile that felt unnatural on his face. "Adora," he said gently, kneeling down beside her. "That young man is not your brother. But sometimes people can look similar," he added quickly. Adora hesitated. Her eyes moved back toward Chibuzor. But the bracelet. Theophilus felt a sharp pressure in his chest. "Enough," he said softly. The nanny placed a reassuring hand on Adora's shoulder and guided her back toward the vehicle. The moment had passed, or at least, everyone pretended it had. The foundation event continued for another hour. Theophilus shook hands with community leaders, spoke with volunteers, and posed for photographs beside recycling stations. Outwardly, nothing appeared different, but inside his mind, something had shifted violently, because the image of that boy refused to leave him. And the bracelet. The bracelet made everything worse. By the time the convoy of SUVs left Ajagun, the afternoon sun was beginning to lower toward the horizon. Inside the back seat of the car, Adora sat quietly beside him. Usually, she talked endlessly after public events, excited by everything she had seen. But today, she seemed thoughtful. After several minutes of silence, she spoke again. "Daddy, yes. Why did that boy have the same bracelet?" Theophilus stared out the window. Traffic moved slowly along the crowded Lagos highway. "I don't know," he said carefully. Adora wasn't convinced, "But you looked scared." He turned toward her. "I wasn't scared." She studied his face closely. Children noticed things adults often missed. "You were," she said quietly. Theophilus opened his mouth to respond. Then he closed it again, because part of him knew she was right. That night, long after Adora had gone to sleep, Theophilus sat alone in his study. The room was large, lined with bookshelves and framed awards recognizing the achievements of Ugwu dynamics. But none of those accomplishments mattered at that moment. On the desk in front of him lay an old wooden box. He had not opened it in years. Theophilus hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside were only a few objects: a photograph, several folded letters, and a broken bracelet. His fingers hovered above it. Then he picked it up slowly. The woven cord was faded with age. The small silver charm still reflected light when it moved. His mind drifted backward through time. 14 years earlier, the campus of University of Nigeria, Nsukka. A young woman standing beneath a tall mango tree, laughing as she tied the bracelet around his wrist. "You work too much," she had teased. "And you worry too much," he had replied. She had smiled mischievously. "This will remind you to relax." Her name had been Epheoma Okafor. Theophilus closed his eyes. For a moment, the memory felt painfully alive. He could hear her voice, feel the warmth of her hand. But the memory darkened quickly, because the love they once shared had ended in confusion, anger, and silence. Back then, Theophilus had still been the son of a powerful businessman. His father, Chief Emmanuel Ugwu, had already begun preparing him to inherit the family empire. When Epheoma became pregnant, everything changed. Theophilus remembered the night clearly, the small apartment where they had been living near campus. Epheoma sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she told him the news. "I'm pregnant," she had whispered. Theophilus had not been angry. He had been afraid, but he had also been determined. "We'll figure it out," he had promised. "I won't abandon you." At the time, he had believed those words completely, but the world around them had been far more powerful than two young people in love. Within weeks, his father discovered the relationship. Chief Emmanuel Ugwu had been furious. "You will destroy everything we have built," the older man had said coldly. "That girl is beneath this family." "She's not," Theophilus had argued, but his father had already made a decision. Soon after, Theophilus was sent abroad for a business training program. His phone was taken. His access to Epheoma disappeared overnight. By the time he returned months later, she was gone. No letters, no address, no explanation. Theophilus had searched for a while, but eventually the pressure of family expectations and the rapid growth of his career pulled him forward. Life moved on. Success came quickly, and the past slowly faded into silence. Now sitting alone in his study, Theophilus turned the broken bracelet in his hands. And for the first time in many years, a question rose inside his mind. A question he had never fully allowed himself to ask. What if Epheoma had not left willingly? What if something else had happened? And what if the boy from Ajagun, the boy with the familiar eyes and the same bracelet, was not a coincidence at all? Across the city in the small house in Ajagun, Chibuzor Okafor sat beside his grandmother's bed. Mama Enkem had fallen asleep again after taking her medicine. The room was quiet. Chibuzor rested his elbows on his knees, staring down at the bracelet on his wrist. He had worn it since childhood. His grandmother always said it was the only thing his mother left him. Earlier that day, the strange little girl had pointed at him, saying something that made everyone laugh. "My brother." Chibuzor shook his head slightly. Rich people lived in a completely different world. Their lives had nothing to do with his. Still, he couldn't forget the expression on the rich man's face, the moment their eyes met. It had not looked like anger or disgust. It had looked like something else entirely. Something closer to shock. Chibuzor leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes. Outside, the sounds of Ajagun drifted through the open window. Motorcycles, voices, music playing somewhere in the distance. Life continued the same as always. Yet far away in Ikoyi, another man lay awake in a quiet mansion staring at the same symbol. A bracelet, a memory, and a question that refused to disappear. Because if the past he once buried was beginning to return, then the truth waiting behind it could change both of their lives forever. The next morning, Lagos woke under a gray sky that threatened rain. Inside the glass headquarters of Ugwu Dynamics, the top-floor boardroom buzzed with quiet conversations. Executives had gathered early for the weekly leadership meeting, their laptops, open reports stacked neatly in front of them. At the far end of the long polished table sat Theophilus Ugwu. Normally these meetings ran with clockwork precision under his leadership. Theophilus was known for sharp focus, quick decisions, and an almost intimidating clarity of thought. But today, something was different. While the head of marketing presented quarterly projections, Theophilus stared silently at the screen without truly seeing it. His mind was somewhere else entirely. The image of a teenage boy beside a rusted garbage cart refused to fade. So the voice snapped him back to the room. It was Emeka Obi, his executive assistant. "The team is waiting for your approval on the expansion proposal." Theophilus blinked. "Yes, approved." The executives exchanged quick glances. Usually he asked detailed questions before approving any major decision. But today, he seemed distracted. Emeka noticed it immediately. He had worked beside Theophilus for nearly 7 years and knew the subtle changes in his employer's behavior better than anyone. Something had clearly unsettled him. When the meeting ended, Emeka followed Theophilus into his office. "Sir," he said carefully, closing the door behind them. "Is everything all right?" Theophilus walked to the window overlooking Victoria Island skyline. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he turned. "I need you to find information about someone." Emeka nodded. Of course. A boy, Theophilus said. About 13 years old. Emeka waited. He lives in Ajagun, Theophilus continued slowly. His name is Chibuzor Okafor. Emeka's eyebrows lifted slightly. Is this related to yesterday's foundation event? Yes. Emeka didn't ask further questions. His job had taught him that patience often revealed more information than curiosity. What exactly should I find out, he asked. Everything, Theophilus replied. Where he lives, who his family is, his school, anything about his mother. Emeka nodded again. I'll start immediately. But before leaving he paused. Sir, if I may ask, is this a security matter? Theophilus hesitated. No, it's personal. Emeka gave a small, respectful bow of his head and left the office. Within minutes he had begun making calls. Meanwhile, across the city in Ajagun Chibuzor, Okafor pushed his cart along the same dusty road he traveled every day. The rain had not yet started, but the air felt heavy with humidity. He had finished school early that afternoon and was already searching through recycling bins. The events from the charity day had faded quickly in his mind. People like the Ugwu family lived far beyond the edges of his reality. But something new happened that day. As Chibuzor turned into a narrow alley behind a market, a sleek black car slowed quietly near the entrance. The vehicle looked strangely out of place among the crowded streets and small shops. Inside the car sat Emeka Obi. He watched carefully as the teenage boy pushed his cart toward a pile of discarded bottles. Emeka had already confirmed the basics: the boy's name, his school, his home address. What surprised him most was the boy's academic record. Chibuzor Okafor ranked among the top students in his class. Despite his circumstances, teachers described him as disciplined and intelligent. Emeka leaned back in the seat, thoughtfully. Interesting, he murmured. The driver glanced at him through the mirror. Sir, nothing. Emeka stepped out of the car. He approached the alley slowly. Chibuzor noticed him immediately. Years of navigating difficult situations had sharpened his instincts. He straightened and rested one hand on the cart handle. Yes, the boy asked cautiously. Emeka smiled politely. My name is Emeka. Chibuzor nodded but did not move closer. What do you want? I work for Mr. Theophilus Ugwu. At the name, Chibuzor stiffened slightly. He remembered the wealthy man from the charity event, and Emeka kept his voice calm. Mr. Ugwu noticed you during the event yesterday. Chibuzor frowned. Why, he was impressed by how hard you work. The boy's expression turned skeptical. Rich men did not usually visit garbage collectors because they were impressed. I'm busy, Chibuzor said simply. Emeka respected the response. I understand, he replied, but Mr. Ugwu would like to help you. I don't need help. Emeka nodded slowly. Your grandmother is sick. That sentence made Chibuzor's eyes flash. How do you know that? We asked around. Chibuzor's grip tightened on the cart. The idea that strangers had been investigating his life felt deeply uncomfortable. Tell your boss I'm fine, he said firmly. I take care of my family myself. Emeka studied him carefully. The pride in the boy's voice reminded him of someone else. Someone who had built an empire from nothing. Very well, Emeka said finally. But if you ever need assistance, here is my card. He placed a small business card on top of the cart. Chibuzor did not touch it. Emeka walked back to the car. Before entering, he glanced over his shoulder. The boy had already returned to sorting bottles, acting as though the conversation had never happened. Emeka shook his head slightly. Back in Ikoyi that evening, Emeka delivered his report. Theophilus listened silently as every detail was explained. His grandmother's name is Enkem Okafor, Emeka said. She raised him after his mother died. Theophilus leaned forward. His mother, Epheoma Okafor. The name struck like lightning. For several seconds, Theophilus said nothing. Emeka continued carefully. She passed away about 12 years ago. The room fell silent. Theophilus felt as if the air had suddenly grown heavy. How, he asked quietly. The records are unclear, Emeka replied. Some say illness, others say complications after childbirth. Theophilus's hands tightened slightly on the desk. Did anyone confirm the father? No official record. Emeka paused before adding the final detail. The boy refuses help from anyone. A long silence followed. Theophilus stood slowly and walked toward the window. Outside, rain had finally begun falling over Lagos. Drops struck the glass in quiet rhythms. Somewhere across the city, a teenage boy continued pushing a cart through narrow streets. A boy who might. Theophilus forced the thought away. Not yet. He needed certainty. Behind him, Emeka spoke carefully. Sir, should I continue investigating? Theophilus nodded. Yes. Then he added quietly. But do not frighten the boy. Emeka understood immediately. This matters to you. Theophilus did not answer directly, but after Emeka left the office, he stood alone for a long time, watching the rain. Because the deeper the investigation went, the more one terrifying possibility began to grow clearer. What if the boy he had seen beside the garbage cart was not just a reminder of the past? What if he was the past itself, alive, growing, and waiting unknowingly for answers that had been hidden for 14 years? 2 afternoons later, the sky above Lagos had returned to its usual blazing blue. In the quiet gardens of the Ugwu mansion, in Ikoyi, 8-year-old Adora Ugwu sat beneath a large mango tree with a book open on her lap. But she wasn't reading. Her mind was somewhere else. Every few seconds she glanced toward the front gate of the property as if expecting something or someone to appear. Across the lawn, the house nanny Mrs. Halima watched her carefully. "Why aren't you reading?" Halima asked. Adora sighed dramatically. "Because I'm thinking." "That sounds dangerous," Halima joked gently. Adora ignored the comment. "Halima, do you remember the boy from Ajagun?" Halima immediately knew who she meant. "Yes, the one with the cart." Adora nodded. "I keep thinking about him." Halima sat down beside her. Why? Adora frowned thoughtfully. "Because when I looked at him, it felt strange." How? Adora struggled to explain. "Like when you meet someone you've seen before, but you can't remember where." Halima said nothing for a moment. Children often noticed things adults overlooked, but she also knew better than to encourage ideas that might confuse Adora. "Sometimes our minds play tricks," Halima said gently, but Adora shook her head. "No." She closed the book and stood up. "I want to go back there." Halima's eyebrows rose. "To Ajagun?" "Yes, that's not something we can decide on our own." Adora crossed her arms stubbornly. "But Daddy goes there." "Yes, for work." Adora thought for a moment. Then a mischievous smile appeared on her face. "Then we will go for work too." Halima immediately understood that Adora had already formed a plan, and experience had taught her something important about the young girl. Once Adora Ugwu decided to do something, convincing her otherwise could be very difficult. The following afternoon, Halima reluctantly found herself sitting in the back seat of a small foundation vehicle, driving toward Ajagun. Adora sat beside her, looking extremely satisfied. "How exactly did this happen?" Halima muttered. Adora grinned. "I told Daddy I wanted to give books to children." Halima sighed, and, surprisingly, it had worked. Theophilus had approved the idea almost immediately. "Take some supplies from the foundation storage," he had said. "Education matters." Neither of them mentioned the real reason Adora had insisted on returning. The car stopped near the same street where the cleanup campaign had taken place days earlier. Ajagun looked as busy as ever. Children ran between small houses. Vendors called out prices. Music drifted through the air from an old speaker somewhere nearby. Adora stepped out of the vehicle holding a small box of notebooks. Her eyes moved quickly across the street, searching. Then she saw him. At the far end of the road, Chibuzor Okafor pushed his wooden cart toward a recycling bin behind a food stall. Adora's face brightened immediately. "That's him!" Halima grabbed her hand quickly. "Slow down." But Adora was already moving. Chibuzor noticed the approaching girl before she reached him. At first he assumed she was simply curious. Wealthy children sometimes visited neighborhoods like Ajagun with charity groups. But when she stopped directly in front of him, smiling widely, he felt slightly confused. "Hello," Adora said. Chibuzor wiped his hands on his shirt. "Hello." She pointed toward his cart. "Is that your job?" "Yes, every day after school." Adora nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds like a lot of work." Chibuzor shrugged. "It's normal." Halima finally caught up to them. "I'm sorry," she said politely. She just wanted to say hello. Chibuzor shook his head. "It's fine." Adora leaned closer to inspect the sacks in the cart. "You sort them by type?" she asked. "Yes." "Plastic, metal, cardboard." Adora's eyes widened with interest. "That's like science." Chibuzor smiled slightly. "I guess." For a moment, the strange meeting felt surprisingly normal. Two children talking about simple things. But then Adora noticed something again. The bracelet. Up close, the woven cord looked even more familiar. She reached out instinctively. "Can I see it?" Chibuzor hesitated, but something about her curiosity felt harmless. He held out his wrist. Adora examined the bracelet carefully. "Yes," she whispered. "It's the same." Chibuzor frowned. "What, my daddy has one like this?" That sentence made Halima stiffen slightly. Chibuzor tilted his head. "Your father?" "Yes, the rich man." Adora nodded proudly. "He's Theophilus Ugwu." Chibuzor's eyes widened slightly. Of course he knew the name. Everyone in Lagos knew that name. "You're his daughter?" he asked. "Yes." Adora pointed between them. "That means we might be family." Halima quickly stepped forward. "Adora." But the girl continued. "My daddy looked scared when he saw you." Chibuzor felt a strange discomfort in his chest. The conversation had suddenly become serious. "I don't know your father," he said quietly. Adora frowned. "Maybe you forgot." Halima knelt down beside her. "That's enough." But Adora turned back to Chibuzor. "What's your name, Chibuzor?" "I'm Adora." She smiled brightly. Then she did something completely unexpected. She reached into the box she was carrying and handed him a notebook. "For school." Chibuzor stared at it. "You don't have to. I want to." He accepted the notebook slowly. "Thank you." Adora seemed pleased. For several seconds they simply stood there. Two children from worlds that rarely touched. Then Halima gently took Adora's hand again. "We should go." Adora nodded. But before leaving, she turned back toward Chibuzor. "You're nice," she said. Chibuzor gave a small smile. "You too." The foundation car drove away a few minutes later. Chibuzor watched it disappear down the road. In his hand, he still held the notebook. Inside the vehicle, Adora leaned against the window. "I like him," she said. Halima sighed softly. "I can tell, but he's sad." Halima didn't respond. Adora looked thoughtful again. "Do you think Daddy knows him?" Halima hesitated. "I don't know," but deep down, she suspected the answer might be yes. That evening, when Theophilus Ugwu returned home from the office, Adora ran to meet him at the front door. "Daddy." He smiled and lifted her easily into his arms. "How was your day?" "I met the boy again." Theophilus froze. "What boy?" "The one from Ajagun. His heart skipped slightly. You went there to give books. He lowered her slowly, and Adora looked excited. He's very nice. Theophilus said nothing. Then she added the words that made his chest tighten. And Daddy, he has the same bracelet as you. Theophilus felt the room grow, strangely quiet. Because the more Adora spoke about the boy, the harder it became to believe this was just coincidence. Somewhere deep in his mind, the same question continued growing louder. What if the past he thought was gone had never actually disappeared at all? The conversation with Adora stayed in Theophilus Ugwu's mind, long after the house had fallen silent that night. After dinner, Adora had been sent upstairs to prepare for bed. Her laughter faded gradually as she disappeared into the second floor of the mansion, leaving the downstairs rooms quiet again. But Theophilus did not return to his study immediately. Instead, he remained seated alone at the dining table, staring at the empty chair where his daughter had been sitting. He has the same bracelet as you. The words repeated themselves in his thoughts. At first, he had tried to dismiss the idea. Children often imagined connections where none existed. But the problem was not Adora's imagination. The problem was the bracelet. There had only ever been two. One had belonged to him. The other had belonged to Epheoma. And the broken one in his study drawer was proof of that, which meant the bracelet on the boy's wrist could not exist without an explanation. Theophilus stood slowly and walked toward his office. The mansion hallways were dimly lit, and the sound of his footsteps echoed softly against the marble floor. Inside the study, the same wooden box still sat on his desk. He opened it again. The broken bracelet lay exactly where he had left it. His fingers brushed against the silver charm. 14 years. 14 years since he had last seen Epheoma Okafor. And now suddenly, her name had returned to his life, like a storm. Theophilus leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. Memories he had buried long ago began surfacing with painful clarity. Epheoma had been stubborn. That was one of the first things he had loved about her. She never pretended to be impressed by wealth or power. When they first met during their university years, she had treated him exactly the same as everyone else. "You're too serious," she used to tell him. "You think life is only about plans. And you think life is only about dreams," he would reply. She laughed every time. That laugh had once filled his entire world. But the world they lived in had not allowed their love to remain simple. Theophilus's father had been ruthless about protecting the family reputation. A relationship with a poor student from a struggling family was unacceptable. And a pregnancy, that was unthinkable. When Chief Emmanuel Ugwu intervened, he did not shout or argue. He simply removed obstacles. Theophilus was sent abroad. Phones were taken. Contacts were erased. By the time he returned, Epheoma had disappeared from Lagos completely. At the time, Theophilus had believed the explanation he was given. "She left," his father had said coldly. "She knew she would ruin your future." Those words had haunted him for years, but he had eventually forced himself to accept them, because the alternative was too painful. What if she had never abandoned him? What if she had been forced to disappear? Theophilus opened his eyes again. The question had once been impossible to answer, but now there was a boy in Ajagun wearing her bracelet. And that changed everything. He reached for the phone on his desk. Within seconds, Emeka Obi answered. "Sir, I need more information," Theophilus said quietly. "I'm listening." The boy's mother. "Epheoma Okafor." "Yes. I want everything about her life after she left Lagos." There was a pause on the line. "That may be difficult," Emeka said carefully. "Do it anyway." "Yes, sir." The call ended. Theophilus placed the phone down slowly. Because deep down, he already feared what the answer might be. Across Lagos, in the narrow streets of Ajagun, Chibuzor, Okafor pushed open the door of the small house he shared with his grandmother. The night air was warm and the neighborhood buzzed with its usual energy. Children chased each other through the alley. Music played from a nearby radio. But inside the small house, the atmosphere felt different. Mama Enkem sat upright on the mattress, breathing slowly as if the effort of simply sitting had become exhausting. "You're late," she said gently. "I had extra bottles to sell," Chibuzor replied. He stepped forward and handed her a small bag from the pharmacy. "The medicine." Mama Enkem accepted it with a tired smile. "You always take care of me. That's my job." She shook her head. "It shouldn't be." Chibuzor poured water into a cup and helped her swallow the tablets. Then he sat beside her. For a while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Mama Enkem asked quietly, "Did anything unusual happen today?" Chibuzor hesitated. "Yes, what the rich man's daughter came back." Mama Enkem frowned slightly. "Why to give books to children?" Chibuzor held up the notebook Adora had given him. Mama Enkem studied it. "That was kind of her." She said something strange again, what Chibuzor looked down at the bracelet on his wrist. "She thinks we are family." The old woman's breath caught in her chest. For a moment she said nothing, because those words struck dangerously close to the truth she had hidden for years. "Children say many things," she said carefully. But she noticed the bracelet. Mama Enkem slowly reached for his wrist. Her fingers trembled as they touched the woven cord. "I gave you this when you were a baby," she said softly. "It belonged to your mother." Chibuzor nodded. "I know." Mama Enkem's eyes grew distant. "She loved you very much. What about my father?" The question arrived quietly, but it carried enormous weight. Mama Enkem closed her eyes briefly. For 13 years she had avoided this moment, because once the truth was spoken, nothing could be taken back. She looked at Chibuzor again. His face held the same calm determination she had seen in her daughter long ago. "You will know someday," she said slowly. But not yet. Chibuzor did not argue. He had learned that his grandmother's silences often meant more than words. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. A storm was coming. Back in Ikoyi, Theophilus Ugwu stood at the window of his study watching lightning flash across the Lagos skyline. The city lights flickered beneath the gathering storm clouds. Somewhere out there lived a boy who might be connected to the past he had tried so hard to forget. A boy who had grown up without him. A boy who had pushed a garbage cart through the streets while Theophilus built one of the most successful companies in Africa. The thought made his chest tighten, because if the truth was what he feared, then the cost of his silence had been far greater than he ever imagined. And, somewhere across the city, a teenage boy wearing a small silver bracelet lay awake beside his grandmother's bed. Neither of them knew that the answers they had both been waiting for were finally beginning to move toward them. Slowly, inevitably. And when those answers arrived, they would force the past to reveal everything it had hidden for 14 long years. 3 days after the stormy night, the city of Lagos returned to its usual rhythm. But behind the scenes, something quiet and dangerous had begun moving through the corridors of power surrounding Ugwu dynamics. Inside, a luxurious office overlooking Victoria Island, a man leaned back in his leather chair while reviewing a report that had just arrived on his desk. His name was Uche Ugwu. Tall, well-dressed, and always composed, Uche carried the confident smile of someone who understood how wealth and influence truly worked. He was also Theophilus Ugwu's cousin. For years, Uche had played the role of loyal family ally, serving on the board of Ugwu Dynamics, advising on major investments, and appearing publicly as a supportive relative. But loyalty had never been his true motivation. What Uche respected most in life was power, and power in a family empire depended heavily on inheritance, which was why the report now sitting in front of him felt extremely interesting. He tapped the folder thoughtfully with his fingers. Across the desk sat a private investigator who had been working quietly for the past 2 days. So Uche said calmly, "Tell me again." The investigator adjusted his glasses. "The boy's name is Chibuzor Okafor." "Yes, I read that. He lives in Ajagun with his grandmother Enkem Okafor, and the mother Epheoma Okafor." Uche's smile widened slightly. "That name sounds familiar." The investigator nodded. "It should." He slid another document across the desk. 14 years ago, Epheoma Okafor was a student at the University of Nigeria. Uche skimmed the page quickly, and she was involved in a relationship with a young man from a wealthy family. Uche leaned forward slightly. "Which family?" The investigator hesitated. Then he answered carefully, "The Ugwu family." The room fell silent. For a moment, Uche said nothing. Then he laughed quietly. Well, he leaned back again, folding his hands together. "So, our dear cousin Theophilus might have a little secret walking around the streets of Ajagun." The investigator spoke cautiously. "There's no official record confirming that, but the possibility exists." "Yes." Uche's smile faded into a thoughtful expression. This information had enormous implications. For years, everyone assumed that Adora Ugwu, Theophilus' daughter, would eventually inherit the Ugwu business empire. But if another child existed, especially a son, the entire future of the company could change. And Uche had spent far too many years positioning himself carefully inside the family business to allow unexpected heirs to appear. "Does the boy know?" Uche asked. "No. And Theophilus?" "That part is unclear." Uche tapped the desk again. Then he said something that made the investigator uncomfortable. "We should make sure the situation remains unclear." The investigator frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Uche said calmly, "that rumors and misunderstandings can destroy lives very quickly." He stood and walked toward the large window overlooking the city. In a place like Lagos, a poor boy accused of something unpleasant can lose his reputation overnight. The investigator looked uneasy. "You're suggesting we interfere?" Uche turned slowly. "I'm suggesting we protect the stability of the Ugwu family." His voice was polite, but his eyes carried something far colder. "After all," Uche added softly, "we wouldn't want the press discovering a scandal involving the son of Nigeria's most admired businessman." The investigator understood the message, and although he did not entirely like it, he also knew how these situations usually worked. Money had a way of guiding events. Meanwhile, in Ajagun, life continued exactly as it always had. That afternoon, Chibuzor Okafor stood inside his classroom while the mathematics teacher handed back exam papers. "Excellent work again," the teacher said, placing the paper on Chibuzor's desk. The score written at the top read 96%. Several students turned to stare. One of them was Sola, the same boy who often mocked Chibuzor's work collecting trash. "How does he even study?" Sola muttered loudly. "Probably finds the answers in the garbage." Some students laughed. The teacher frowned. "That's enough." Chibuzor ignored the comment. He had learned long ago that academic success sometimes made people even more resentful. But he didn't study to impress anyone. He studied because it felt like the only path forward. When the final bell rang, he packed his bag and returned to the streets. The recycling cart waited behind the school wall where he always left it. As he pushed it down the road, he noticed something unusual. 2 men stood beside a luxury car parked near the corner of the street. Their clothes were expensive, their shoes spotless, and their expressions impatient. One of them stepped forward when he saw Chibuzor approaching. "You're the boy who collects waste here." Chibuzor stopped cautiously. "Yes, The man glanced at the cart with mild disgust. "What's your name, Chibuzor?" The man nodded slowly. "You work near the rich neighborhoods, sometimes correct." "Sometimes." The second man spoke next. "You were seen near a private residence 2 days ago." Chibuzor frowned. "I collect bottles everywhere." The first man's tone hardened slightly. "And sometimes you collect other things too." Chibuzor felt a ripple of confusion. "What do you mean?" The man pulled out a photograph. It showed a silver watch. Someone reported this missing. Chibuzor stared at the picture. "I've never seen that." The two men exchanged a glance. "We'll see what the police say." The word police sent a sudden chill through Chibuzor's body. He had done nothing wrong, but he also knew how easily people like him were blamed for things they didn't do. "Wait," he said quickly. "I didn't steal anything." But the men were already stepping closer. Behind them, the black car engine started quietly. From inside the vehicle, a driver watched the situation unfold with professional indifference. And far away in his office, overlooking Lagos, Uche, Ugwu sat calmly reviewing financial reports. Because sometimes the easiest way to stop the truth from growing was to bury it beneath suspicion. At that same moment, across the city in the headquarters of Ugwu Dynamics, Theophilus Ugwu stood beside Emeka's desk, reviewing new information. Sir Emeka said carefully, "We found additional records about Epheoma Okafor." Theophilus looked up. "What kind of records?" "Hospital records." Theophilus felt his heart beat slightly faster. "Continue." Emeka opened the file. "There is documentation confirming she gave birth to a child." Theophilus's breath stopped. "And the date?" Emeka read the file again. 13 years ago. The number struck him like a physical blow, because 13 years earlier, Theophilus Ugwu had still been searching desperately for the woman he loved. And somewhere in Lagos at that exact time, a boy named Chibuzor Okafor had just been born. The moment Emeka Obi finished speaking, the office fell completely silent. Theophilus Ugwu did not move. For several seconds he simply stared at the hospital document in Emeka's hand as if hoping the numbers written there would suddenly change. 13 years ago, Emeka repeated quietly. Theophilus slowly lowered himself into the chair behind his desk. His mind began racing through the past. 13 years earlier. That had been the same year he returned to Nigeria after his father forced him abroad. The same year he searched desperately for Epheoma Okafor across Lagos. The same year every trace of her had disappeared. His voice came out low and tight. "Are you certain about this record?" Emeka nodded. "Yes, sir." "Which hospital?" "A small clinic in Surulere." Theophilus pressed his hands together, and the father's name, Emeka, shook his head. "There's no name listed." The room grew quiet again. But inside Theophilus's chest, the silence felt unbearable. Because the more facts appeared, the harder it became to dismiss the possibility he had been trying to avoid. If Epheoma had given birth 13 years ago, and if the boy from Ajagun was 13, then the truth could be far more painful than coincidence. Theophilus stood abruptly. "I want to speak with the boy." Emeka looked slightly surprised. "Directly?" "Yes." "That may not be easy." Why Emeka hesitated. "Because someone else may already be interfering." Theophilus turned sharply. "What do you mean?" Emeka opened another file on the desk. "I received a call from one of our community contacts in Ajagun this morning, and they said 2 men approached the boy yesterday." Theophilus's expression darkened. "Who were they?" "That part is unclear. But they were asking questions about theft." Theophilus felt anger rise slowly in his chest. "Chibuzor." "Yes. Accused of stealing. That's what the report says." Theophilus shook his head immediately. That doesn't make sense. But Emeka said nothing, because in Lagos, accusations did not always need to make sense. Sometimes they only needed the right people behind them. Theophilus grabbed his jacket. "Prepare the car. Where are you going to Ajagunle?" Meanwhile, the situation in Ajagunle had grown more tense. Standing beside the narrow street, Chibuzor Okafor faced the two men who had confronted him. Several neighbors had already gathered nearby, whispering to each other. One of the men spoke into a phone. "Yes, we found him." Chibuzor's hands tightened around the cart handle. "I told you," he said firmly. "I didn't steal anything." The man ignored him. "You collect trash in rich neighborhoods, correct?" "Yes." "So it wouldn't be difficult to take something valuable." "I don't steal," the second man smirked. "That's what everyone says." A few people in the small crowd began murmuring. Some looked sympathetic, others looked doubtful. Life in Ajagunle had taught many residents to distrust situations involving wealthy outsiders, and Chibuzor knew how quickly rumors could grow. A middle-aged woman from a nearby stall stepped forward. "Leave the boy alone," she said sharply. "He works harder than most people here." But the first man waved her away. "This is police business." "Where are the police?" she demanded. "They're coming." Chibuzor felt a knot form in his stomach. He had done nothing wrong, but he also knew that proving innocence could be difficult when powerful people decided otherwise. He glanced down at the bracelet on his wrist. The silver charm glinted in the afternoon sun. For a brief moment, he remembered the rich girl Adora and the strange way she had insisted they might be family. The memory almost made him laugh. The idea felt ridiculous. Yet somehow, the expression on her father's face that day still lingered in his mind. Across the city, a black SUV sped through traffic. Inside the vehicle, Theophilus Ugwu sat beside Emeka, his jaw tight with tension. "How long have they been questioning him?" he asked. "About 20 minutes, according to our contact, and the police not confirmed yet." Theophilus stared out the window. "Someone is trying to intimidate him." Emeka nodded. "I believe so." Who? Emeka hesitated. "There's one possibility." Theophilus turned toward him. "Say it." "Your cousin." "Uche, yes." Theophilus's eyes hardened. "Why would he care about a boy from Ajagunle?" Emeka answered carefully. "Because if the boy is who we think he might be." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Theophilus understood immediately. Inheritance, control, power, all the things that often poisoned wealthy families. The SUV turned sharply into the narrow roads leading toward Ajagunle. Traffic thinned. The buildings became smaller. The air smelled faintly of smoke and salt from the nearby harbor. Finally, the car stopped near the crowd, gathered in the street. Theophilus stepped out. The murmuring voices grew louder. Several people immediately recognized him. "That's him! The billionaire! What is he doing here?" But Theophilus ignored the whispers. His eyes locked instantly on the center of the crowd, on the boy standing beside the cart. And the moment Chibuzor Okafor looked up and saw him again, the strange feeling from their first encounter returned. Neither of them spoke at first. The two men who had been questioning Chibuzor turned toward the newcomer. One of them frowned. "And you are Theophilus," didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked directly toward the boy. The crowd parted instinctively. When he stopped in front of Chibuzor, they stood only a few feet apart. Up close, the resemblance felt even stronger. Theophilus's voice was calm but firm. "This boy is not a thief." The men exchanged uneasy glances. "And how would you know?" Theophilus looked at them coldly. "Because I said so." The confidence in his tone made several people in the crowd whisper. One of the men tried to recover his authority. This investigation is not your concern. Theophilus stepped closer. It is now. For a moment the two men hesitated, then one of them muttered something to the other. A few seconds later, they began backing toward their car. This isn't over, one of them said, but their confidence had clearly weakened. The car door slammed shut. Within seconds, the vehicle disappeared down the road. The crowd slowly relaxed. Some people even clapped softly. But the most important moment had not yet happened, because now Theophilus Ugwu stood face to face with Chibuzor Okafor. For several seconds they simply looked at each other. Finally, Chibuzor spoke. "Why did you help me?" Theophilus hesitated. There were many answers he could give, but none of them felt simple. So instead, he asked the question that had been burning in his mind for days. "Your mother," he said quietly. "Her name was Epheoma Okafor, wasn't it?" The boy's eyes widened slightly. "Yes," Theophilus felt his heartbeat quicken. "And your father, Chibuzor, looked down briefly. I never met him." Those words struck deeper than any accusation, because suddenly, the distance between their two lives felt painfully clear. Theophilus opened his mouth to speak again, but the words refused to come easily. Because if the truth he suspected was real, then the boy, standing in front of him, had grown up without knowing the man responsible for bringing him into the world. And that man was standing only a few steps away. For several long seconds after the confrontation ended, the narrow street in Ajagun remained unusually quiet. The crowd that had gathered slowly began to disperse, though many people still lingered nearby whispering to each other. It was not every day that one of the richest men in Nigeria appeared suddenly in their neighborhood and defended a teenage garbage collector. Some people looked impressed. Others looked suspicious. But Theophilus Ugwu paid no attention to any of them. His entire focus remained on the boy standing in front of him. Chibuzor Okafor still held the handle of his wooden cart, his posture tense but controlled. Years of surviving in difficult situations had taught him not to show fear too easily. But confusion was impossible to hide. "Why did you help me?" he repeated quietly. Theophilus took a slow breath, because the real answer was complicated, and possibly devastating. "I don't like seeing innocent people accused of things they didn't do," he said finally. Chibuzor studied his face carefully. The explanation sounded reasonable, but something about the way the man looked at him felt different from ordinary concern. It felt personal. Theophilus glanced briefly at the bracelet on the boy's wrist. The woven cord, the small silver charm, the exact same charm that now sat broken in a wooden box inside his study. His chest tightened. "Your mother," he said again. "Her name was Epheoma Okafor." "Yes." "What do you remember about her?" Chibuzor hesitated. "Not much." His voice grew quieter. "She died when I was very young." Theophilus felt the words strike like a physical blow. "How old were you?" "Maybe 2. 2 years old." That meant Epheoma had been raising their child alone for at least 2 years before she died. Without him. Without the help he once promised her. The thought made his throat feel tight. Chibuzor noticed the strange expression crossing the man's face. "Did you know her?" the boy asked suddenly. Theophilus froze. For a moment he considered telling the truth, but the situation felt far too fragile. "I knew someone with that name," he said carefully. Chibuzor nodded slowly. "My grandmother says my mother studied at a university." "She did," Theophilus replied quietly. Chibuzor looked surprised. "How do you know that?" Theophilus opened his mouth to respond. But before he could answer, another voice interrupted. "Chibuzor." Both of them turned. An elderly woman was walking slowly toward them from the direction of the small house at the end of the street. Her steps were careful and unsteady. Mama Enkem Okafor had forced herself out of bed, despite her illness. A neighbor had told her what was happening, and the moment she heard the name Theophilus Ugwu, she knew something she had feared for years might finally be happening. Chibuzor hurried toward her. "Mama, you shouldn't be outside." But Mama Enkem's eyes were already fixed on the man standing near the cart. For several seconds, she simply stared. Theophilus felt his heart pound in his chest, because the old woman's face carried a recognition that was impossible to mistake. "You," she whispered. The single word sounded like a breath, carried across time. Chibuzor looked between them in confusion. "Mama, you know him." Mama Enkem didn't answer immediately. Her eyes remained locked on Theophilus. And in that moment, memories from 14 years earlier rushed back into her mind. The young man who used to visit her daughter, the arguments, the tears, the night Epheoma arrived home crying after being told she could never marry into the Ugwu family. Theophilus stepped closer slowly. "Mama Enkem," he said quietly. The old woman's shoulders trembled slightly. "You remember me?" "Yes." The silence between them felt heavy. Chibuzor looked from one face to the other. "Someone explain what is happening." Mama Enkem finally turned toward her grandson. "Chibuzor," her voice shook. "There are things you don't know about your mother." Chibuzor frowned. "I know she died." "Yes, but before that, she loved someone." Theophilus felt his stomach tighten. Mama Enkem looked back at him again. "You promised her you would protect her." The accusation in her voice was unmistakable. Theophilus lowered his head slightly. "I thought she left me." Mama Enkem shook her head slowly. "She never left you." Those words struck the air like thunder. Chibuzor's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" Mama Enkem closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength. "For years your mother tried to reach him." She pointed toward Theophilus. "But powerful people made sure he never saw her letters." Theophilus felt the world tilt slightly beneath his feet. "Letters, yes. She wrote to you again and again. I never received anything." Mama Enkem nodded sadly. "Because your father made sure of that." The revelation hung heavily between them. Theophilus felt anger begin rising slowly in his chest. Not at Mama Enkem, not even at Epheoma, but at the possibility that the man he once trusted most, his own father, had manipulated their lives so completely. Chibuzor stepped backward slightly. His voice sounded uncertain. "Why are you telling me this now?" Mama Enkem looked at him with tired eyes. "Because you deserve the truth, and the truth is..." She struggled to finish the sentence. Theophilus felt his pulse racing. Part of him wanted to stop her, to slow everything down, but another part knew the moment could not be avoided forever. Mama Enkem finally whispered the words that had been locked inside her heart for more than a decade. "The man standing in front of you," her voice broke, "is the one your mother loved." Chibuzor looked at Theophilus again. Really looked this time. Not as a distant wealthy stranger, but as someone who might be connected to his own life in ways he had never imagined. "You're saying," he began slowly. Mama Enkem nodded. "I'm saying the truth you've been asking about for years." Her eyes moved from the boy to the man. "Is standing right here." The street had become completely silent again. Neighbors who had started to leave had quietly gathered once more, sensing something important was unfolding. But for the three people standing at the center of the moment, the crowd no longer mattered, because the past was no longer a distant memory. It had arrived, and it was demanding answers. Chibuzor's voice came out barely above a whisper. "You're saying he knew my mother?" Mama Enkem took a slow breath. "Yes." Chibuzor looked back at Theophilus, And in that moment, the same question that had haunted him his entire life finally rose to the surface. If you knew her, his voice trembled slightly, then where were you when she died? Theophilus felt the weight of the question settle heavily in the air, because for the first time in 13 years, he realized the truth he feared might finally be unavoidable. The question lingered in the air like a storm that had not yet broken. If you knew her, then where were you when she died? The voice of Chibuzor Okafor trembled slightly, but the determination behind the words was unmistakable. Around them, the narrow street in Ajagun had grown completely silent. Even the distant noise of traffic seemed to fade beneath the weight of the moment unfolding between the three figures standing near the battered garbage cart. For the first time since arriving, Theophilus Ugwu had no immediate answer, not because he wanted to hide the truth, but because the truth itself felt unbearable. He took a slow breath. "I didn't know she was dying," he said quietly. Chibuzor's expression hardened almost immediately. "That's convenient." Theophilus did not react to the accusation. "Listen to me," he continued. "I was told she left Nigeria. Who told you that?" "My father." Mama Enkem gave a bitter laugh under her breath. "Yes," she said softly. "That sounds like him." Theophilus turned toward her. "What do you mean?" Mama Enkem's tired eyes carried years of grief. "I mean your father destroyed my daughter's life." The words landed heavily. Several people in the crowd shifted uneasily, sensing the conversation had become far more personal than they expected. Theophilus felt anger rise slowly in his chest. "My father told me she wanted nothing to do with me." He lied. Theophilus stared at her. For a moment, the possibility felt almost impossible to accept. "My father wouldn't. He would," Mama Enkem interrupted firmly. "He did." She turned toward Chibuzor. "Your mother wrote many letters." "To him?" Chibuzor asked. "Yes." Mama Enkem looked back at Theophilus. "But none of them ever reached you." Theophilus felt his pulse begin to race. What letters she wrote to tell you she was pregnant. She wrote to ask for help. And she wrote again when you never answered. Theophilus shook his head slowly. "I never received anything." Mama Enkem nodded sadly. That was the point. The realization struck him with terrifying clarity. If his father had truly intercepted those letters, then everything he believed about the past had been built on lies. Chibuzor spoke again, his voice colder now. "So you just forgot about her?" Theophilus turned toward him. "No, I searched for her. For how long?" Theophilus hesitated. "Months." Chibuzor's eyes flashed. "Months." Theophilus lowered his head slightly. "I was 25 years old. My father controlled everything. But eventually," he stopped speaking, because the rest of the sentence sounded terrible even inside his own mind. Eventually, he had given up. Eventually, he had moved forward with his life. Eventually, he had become one of the richest men in the country. While somewhere else, Epheoma Okafor had struggled to raise a child alone. Chibuzor took a step backward. "So you stopped looking?" Theophilus didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence said enough. For the boy standing in front of him, the story sounded painfully simple. A rich man abandoned a poor woman, and 13 years later appeared suddenly in his life. The anger building inside Chibuzor was impossible to hide now. You had everything he said. Money, power, a big house, and my mother had nothing. Theophilus felt every word like a blade. "You think I knew?" he asked quietly. "What difference does it make?" Chibuzor shot back. The question struck deeply, because in many ways, it didn't change the outcome. The damage had already been done. Mama Enkem suddenly swayed slightly on her feet. Chibuzor immediately rushed to support her. "Mama, I'm all right," she whispered. But the effort of standing had clearly drained her strength. Theophilus stepped forward instinctively. "You need to sit." She waved him away. "No, I have waited too many years to speak." Her voice trembled, but her eyes remained steady. "My daughter died believing you abandoned her." The words struck Theophilus like thunder. He closed his eyes briefly. She deserved better. "Yes," Mama Enkem said softly. She did. Chibuzor helped his grandmother sit on a nearby wooden crate. The tension in the street had grown heavy enough that even the curious neighbors now stood quietly. Because this was no longer just a family argument. It was the unraveling of a story that had remained hidden for over a decade. Finally, Chibuzor spoke again. "What do you want from us?" Theophilus hesitated. Because the honest answer was complicated. "I want the truth," he said. "You already have it." "No." He looked directly at the boy. "I want to know what happened after she disappeared." Mama Enkem answered this time. "She came home, pregnant, heartbroken." Theophilus felt his chest tighten. "She believed you had abandoned her." "I didn't, but she didn't know that." Mama Enkem's voice softened slightly. "She raised Chibuzor alone. For 2 years, and then she became sick." "What kind of illness?" "The doctors said infection. She never recovered." Theophilus looked at the ground, because suddenly the timeline made horrifying sense. While he had been building the early foundations of his company, the woman he once loved had been fighting for her life. Without him, without support. Chibuzor watched the man's expression carefully. Part of him wanted to remain angry, but another part noticed something unexpected. Theophilus Ugwu did not look like a man pretending to care. He looked like a man realizing he had lost something he never knew existed. The silence stretched again. Finally, Mama Enkem spoke quietly. "There is something else you should know." Both men looked at her. Epheoma kept copies of those letters. Theophilus felt a flicker of hope. "You still have them?" "Yes." "Where?" "In my house." Theophilus stepped forward. "I need to see them." Chibuzor immediately stiffened. "Why?" "Because if what Mama Enkem says is true." Theophilus paused. Then he finished the sentence carefully. "Then someone in my family destroyed both of our lives." The words hung in the air, and somewhere across Lagos, inside a high-rise office overlooking the city, Uche Ugwu stood beside a window speaking quietly into a phone. "Yes," he said, calmly. The first step worked. The voice on the other end asked something. Uche smiled faintly. "No, the situation isn't finished yet." He glanced down at the busy streets far below. "Because once the truth begins moving, you must bury it quickly." Back in Ajagun, the 3 figures near the cart had no idea that their painful reunion had already attracted dangerous attention. But the past they had just begun uncovering was no longer just a family matter. It had become something far more complicated, something powerful people would not allow to surface easily. The small house at the end of the narrow Ajagun street felt even smaller once Theophilus Ugwu stepped inside. For most of his adult life, he had lived in spaces designed to impress boardrooms with glass walls, hotels overlooking oceans, a mansion filled with marble and polished wood. But this house was different. 2 small rooms, a cracked cement floor, a rusted ceiling fan turning slowly above them. Yet somehow the air inside felt heavier than any boardroom he had ever entered. Because this was the place where Epheoma Okafor had spent the last years of her life. And the man she once loved had never even known. Chibuzor Okafor stood near the doorway, arms folded across his chest, watching Theophilus carefully. The tension between them had not disappeared. If anything, it had grown stronger. But for the moment, curiosity had pushed aside anger. Because everyone in the room understood something important. The letters. Those letters could reveal everything. Mama Enkem slowly lowered herself onto the edge of the mattress. Her breathing was heavier than usual, and Chibuzor quickly placed a pillow behind her back. "You should rest," he said quietly. "I will," she replied. "But first," she nodded toward the small wooden trunk sitting beneath the window. Chibuzor walked over and lifted the lid. Inside were only a few belongings, clothes, folded carefully, a faded photograph of Epheoma, and a bundle of yellowed envelopes tied together with thread. For a moment, Chibuzor hesitated. He had seen the envelopes before, but Mama Enkem had never allowed him to read them. "They were for him," she said softly. Her eyes moved toward Theophilus. Chibuzor untied the thread slowly. The envelopes were worn with age, the paper fragile. Each one carried the same name written carefully across the front: Theophilus Ugwu. The sight made Theophilus's chest tighten. His own name, written by the woman he had once promised to protect, and never received. Chibuzor handed him the first letter. Theophilus held it carefully, almost afraid to open it. The date, written in the corner, stopped his breath. 14 years ago. He unfolded the paper slowly. The handwriting was unmistakable. Epheoma's. For a moment, the room faded away as his eyes moved across the words. "Theo, I don't know if this letter will reach you. Your father's men told me you left the country. They said you didn't want to see me again. But I don't believe that. I have to believe the man I loved wouldn't disappear like that. I'm writing because there is something you must know. I'm pregnant." Theophilus felt his hands begin to tremble. He continued reading. "I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking for anything except the truth. If you truly want me gone, tell me yourself. But please don't let strangers decide our lives." The letter ended simply. "I still believe in you." Epheoma Theophilus lowered the paper slowly. For several seconds, he could not speak. Chibuzor watched his face carefully. "Is that really her handwriting?" the boy asked quietly. "Yes," Theophilus whispered. He opened the second letter. This one had been written 3 months later. "Theo, I haven't heard from you. Maybe my first letter never arrived. The baby is growing. Sometimes I sit at night and wonder what kind of father you would have been. I'm scared, but Mama Enkem is helping me. I still hope you will answer." Theophilus's vision blurred slightly, because the letter described months when he had been living in London, under his father's strict supervision, cut off from everyone he once knew. He had believed Epheoma had abandoned him. Meanwhile, she had been waiting for him to respond. The third letter was shorter and far more painful. "Theo, I think I understand now. Your silence is your answer. I will not write again. But if someday you wonder what happened to us, our son deserves to know you once loved his mother." Theophilus closed his eyes. "Our son." The words echoed through his mind. For years he had believed his life began only after he built Ugwu Dynamics, but the truth was far more complicated. His life had continued somewhere else, without him. He looked up slowly. Across the room stood the boy those letters had been written about. Chibuzor Okafor, his son. The realization struck with overwhelming force. But Chibuzor still looked uncertain. "Did she write more?" the boy asked. Mama Enkem nodded slowly. "One last letter." Chibuzor handed it to Theophilus. The envelope looked more worn than the others. The date written in the corner was 12 years ago. Theophilus opened it carefully. The handwriting was weaker this time, the ink uneven. "Theo, if this letter reaches you, it will probably be the last one. I'm sick. The doctors say the infection is serious. I'm not afraid for myself. I'm afraid for our son. His name is Chibuzor. Please remember that. He deserves more than the life I can give him." Theophilus felt a sharp pain in his chest. He continued reading. If you never receive this, then maybe fate has decided our story ends here. But if you do, please find him. Please make sure he knows his mother loved him more than anything in this world. The letter ended with a single line. Goodbye, Theo. Theophilus lowered the paper slowly. The room felt unbearably quiet. Across from him, Chibuzor stood frozen. You're saying, the boy whispered, she wrote all those letters to you. Yes, and you never answered. I never received them. Chibuzor looked down at the floor. For years he had imagined many possibilities about his father. Some were worse than others. But he had never imagined something like this. Mama Enkem spoke softly. Your father's family did everything they could to keep them apart. Theophilus looked up sharply. My father, yes. He visited this house once. Theophilus felt his pulse quicken when after Epheoma told him she was pregnant. What did he say? Mama Enkem's expression hardened slightly. He said the Ugwu family would never allow a scandal. The anger inside Theophilus burned hotter, because suddenly the pieces of the past began falling into place. The intercepted letters, the forced trip abroad, the sudden disappearance of the woman he loved. All of it had been carefully arranged. Chibuzor spoke again. So what happens now? Theophilus looked at him. For the first time, the answer felt painfully clear. Now, he paused. The truth comes out. Outside the small house, the sun had begun to set over Ajagun. But somewhere across Lagos, inside a tall office building overlooking the city lights, Uche Ugwu was receiving new information from his contacts. Yes, the voice on the phone said. He met the boy. Uche smiled faintly. And they are talking. Uche's eyes narrowed. That's unfortunate. He walked slowly toward the window. The city stretched beneath him like a glowing web of lights. Well, he murmured quietly, if the past is beginning to surface, then we must make sure it doesn't survive long enough to reach the future. Because the truth Theophilus Ugwu had just discovered was far more dangerous than anyone in that small Ajagun house realized, and the battle to protect or destroy that truth had only just begun. Night settled slowly over Lagos, but the city never truly slept. Traffic lights glowed red and green across busy intersections. Music drifted from rooftop bars. Office towers remained lit with the restless energy of people chasing opportunity long after sunset. But inside the towering headquarters of Ugwu Dynamics, the atmosphere that evening was far from ordinary. Every senior executive in the company had received an urgent message that afternoon, mandatory board meeting, attendance required. No explanation had been provided, which meant the situation was serious. Inside the executive boardroom on the top floor, a long polished table stretched across the center of the room. Screens on the walls displayed financial charts and company reports, though none of them were currently being discussed. Instead, the room filled with quiet speculation. Do you know what this is about? One director whispered. No idea. Maybe a new acquisition or a crisis. Across the table, Uche Ugwu sat calmly reviewing a document on his tablet. Outwardly, he looked relaxed, but his mind was working quickly. The phone call he had received earlier that afternoon had confirmed his worst suspicion. Theophilus had met the boy. That meant the truth about the past was dangerously close to surfacing, and if that truth reached the public, it could destabilize everything. Still, Uche remained confident. Powerful families survived scandals all the time. The key was controlling the narrative before it grew too large. The boardroom doors suddenly opened. Conversation stopped immediately. Theophilus Ugwu walked into the room. Behind him followed Emeka Obi, carrying a thick folder of documents. Several executives straightened in their seats. Theophilus rarely called meetings without clear agendas. But tonight his expression looked different. Not angry, not anxious. Something else entirely. Resolved. He reached the head of the table and placed both hands on the polished surface. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," he began. His voice was calm, but every word carried unusual weight. "This meeting concerns something personal." A few executives exchanged puzzled glances. Uche watched quietly from his seat. Personal matters did not usually require the entire board. Theophilus continued. "For 14 years I believed a lie about my past. The room grew still, a lie that involved someone I once loved." Uche felt a small tension in his chest. Theophilus opened the folder Emeka had placed on the table. Inside were copies of the letters. "I recently discovered that my father intercepted correspondence meant for me." He lifted one letter and placed it on the table so the others could see. These were written by Epheoma Okafor. Several board members leaned forward. The name meant nothing to them. But Uche knew exactly where this was going, and for the first time that evening, his confidence faltered slightly. "These letters were written 14 years ago," Theophilus continued. "They reveal that Epheoma was pregnant when she disappeared from my life." The room erupted with quiet murmurs. A few executives glanced at each other in shock. Uche finally spoke. "Theophilus," he said calmly, "this seems like a private family matter." Theophilus turned toward him. "Yes, it is, but the consequences affect more than just my family." He paused. "Because the child described in those letters," the room fell silent again, "is alive." The words seemed to echo against the glass walls. Uche felt his jaw tighten. "And who exactly is this child?" one director asked cautiously. Theophilus looked around the room. His voice did not waver. "A 13-year-old boy named Chibuzor Okafor." Another wave of murmurs spread through the boardroom. Someone leaned toward their neighbor and whispered, "That's impossible." Uche stood slowly. "Before we continue," he said, "perhaps we should verify these claims privately. Announcing something like this without proper evidence could damage the company." Theophilus met his gaze calmly. "The evidence exists, and I intend to present it." Uche forced a thin smile. "Surely this can wait." "No." Theophilus reached into the folder again. He removed a sealed envelope and placed it on the table. "Earlier today, I requested a DNA test. The room went completely silent. The results arrived 1 hour ago." Uche's stomach tightened. He had not expected things to move this quickly. Theophilus opened the envelope. Every eye in the room watched him. Then he read the final line aloud. "The probability of paternity is 99.98%. No one spoke, because the meaning of those numbers was unmistakable. Chibuzor Okafor was his son. Across the table, Uche felt the ground shift beneath him. This had escalated far beyond what he had anticipated. One of the directors finally asked the obvious question. "Why are you telling us this?" Now Theophilus looked around the room carefully. "Because someone in this building attempted to intimidate that boy." Several heads turned. Uche's heart skipped once. Theophilus's voice hardened slightly. "Yesterday, 2 men confronted Chibuzor and falsely accused him of theft." A director frowned. "That's serious." "Yes, and those men were hired." Uche spoke again quickly. "You're suggesting someone in this company arranged it." "I'm stating that possibility." Theophilus turned slowly toward his cousin. "Especially someone who would benefit if that boy disappeared from the picture." The accusation hung heavily in the air. All eyes turned toward Uche Ugwu. For the first time, the confident businessman felt the pressure of the room shift against him. "This is absurd," Uche said calmly. "You're making a serious accusation without proof." Theophilus held up another document. I anticipated that response. He placed the paper on the table. Phone records. They link the investigator hired to follow Chibuzor directly to one of your financial accounts. A murmur spread across the room. Uche's composure finally cracked. "You're making a mistake." "No," Theophilus said quietly. "I made my mistake 14 years ago." He stepped closer to the table. "But I won't make it again." The silence that followed felt enormous. Finally, one of the board members spoke. "What are you planning to do?" Theophilus answered without hesitation. "I am acknowledging Chibuzor Okafor as my son." Another wave of shock rippled through the room, and more importantly, he continued. "I am correcting the injustice that allowed my family to abandon him and his mother." His voice softened slightly. "For 13 years that boy pushed a garbage cart through the streets of Lagos, while I built a billion-dollar company." The words carried both regret and determination. "That ends now." Uche realized something terrifying in that moment. The battle he thought he could control had already been lost. Because Theophilus was no longer hiding the truth, he was announcing it, publicly. And once the truth reached the media, nothing could bury it again. Across the city in Ajagun, Chibuzor Okafor sat quietly beside his grandmother's bed, unaware that his life had just been changed forever. And inside the Ugwu Dynamics boardroom, the truth that had been hidden for 14 years had finally broken into the open. But the most difficult moment still remained. Because the boy who had grown up without a father had not yet decided whether he wanted one now. By the next morning, Lagos was already buzzing with rumors. News traveled quickly in a city that thrived on stories, and by sunrise the first headlines had begun appearing across social media. Tech billionaire Theophilus Ugwu reveals secret son, Ajagun. Trash collector identified as heir to Ugwu dynasty. DNA test confirms shock family revelation. Television stations replayed footage of Theophilus leaving the Ugwu Dynamics headquarters late the night before, surrounded by reporters shouting questions. Inside his Ikoyi mansion, the atmosphere felt unusually tense. Theophilus stood in his study staring at the news headlines glowing across his laptop screen. He had known the announcement would spread quickly, but the speed still surprised him. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from journalists, investors, and business partners. Some offered congratulations. Others asked cautious questions about what the revelation meant for the future of the company. But none of those conversations mattered to him as much as one unanswered question. Would Chibuzor accept him? Behind him, the study door opened quietly. 8-year-old Adora Ugwu stepped inside, holding her tablet. Daddy Theophilus turned. "Yes." She climbed onto one of the chairs near the desk. "My friends at school are sending me messages." "What kind of messages?" Adora tilted the screen toward him. One of the headlines was visible. "Your dad has another kid." "Is it true?" she asked. Theophilus walked over and sat beside her. "Yes." Adora studied his face carefully. "So that means," she smiled slowly, "I really do have a brother." Theophilus nodded. "Yes." Adora clapped her hands once with excitement. "I knew it." But then her expression softened. "Is he coming here?" Theophilus hesitated. "I don't know yet. Why? Because he might not want to." Adora frowned. "But we're family." Theophilus smiled gently. "Sometimes families take time to understand each other." Adora considered that. Then she said something that made him pause. "Then we should give him time." Across Lagos, in the narrow streets of Ajagun, the situation was far more chaotic. Outside the small house where Chibuzor Okafor lived, several reporters had already gathered. Cameras waited near the entrance. Microphones hovered in the air like curious birds. Is it true you're the billionaire's son? Did you know before yesterday will you move to Ikoyi, neighbors crowded nearby watching the unexpected spectacle unfold? Inside the house, Chibuzor sat quietly at the small table while Mama Enkem rested on the mattress. He had not slept much. The news had reached him late the previous night, when a neighbor burst through the door, holding a phone. At first he thought it was a joke, but the DNA results were everywhere. The name, Chibuzor Okafor, had suddenly become known across the entire city. He looked down at the bracelet on his wrist, the same bracelet his mother had given him when he was a baby. For years, it had been the only connection he had to the father he never knew. Now that father had appeared suddenly in his life, rich, powerful, and full of regret. Mama Enkem watched him quietly. "You don't have to decide anything today," she said gently. Chibuzor nodded. "I know." But the situation already felt overwhelming. He had lived his entire life in Ajagun. His world was small but familiar. Now strangers were calling him an heir to a billion-dollar company. The idea felt unreal. A knock sounded on the door. Chibuzor stiffened. Mama Enkem looked toward him. "Go see who it is." He stood slowly and walked to the door. When he opened it, the person standing outside made him freeze. Theophilus Ugwu stood there alone. No reporters, no bodyguards, just the man. "Good morning," Theophilus said quietly. Chibuzor glanced behind him. Several journalists tried to move closer, but a security guard from the Ugwu Foundation stepped forward to block them. Chibuzor stepped outside and closed the door behind him. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Theophilus broke the silence first. "I'm sorry." The words sounded simple, but the weight behind them was enormous. Chibuzor looked down at the ground. "You didn't even know I existed." "That's true. But I should have." Chibuzor didn't answer. Theophilus continued. "I can't change the past, but I can change what happens next." The boy finally looked up. "What does that mean?" "It means you have choices. What kind of choices? You can stay here. You can come to Ikoyi. You can attend any school you want. You can decide how much you want me in your life." Chibuzor studied him carefully. "And if I choose nothing," Theophilus nodded slowly, "then I will respect that." The honesty in the answer surprised him. For a moment, Chibuzor said nothing. Then he asked the question that had been growing in his mind all night. "Why now?" Theophilus looked toward the sky briefly. "Because the truth finally found its way to me. And once I saw it," his voice grew quieter, "I couldn't ignore it anymore." Chibuzor's eyes moved again to the bracelet on his wrist. "My mother believed in you," he said. Theophilus felt the words strike deeply. "I wish I had deserved that belief." A long silence followed. Finally, Chibuzor spoke again. "I'm not ready to call you my father." Theophilus nodded immediately. "I understand, but—" Chibuzor hesitated. "My sister seems nice." Theophilus blinked. "Adora. Yes, she gave me a notebook." A small smile appeared on Theophilus's face. "That sounds like her." Chibuzor looked toward the busy street outside the house. Then he turned back. "I'll visit." Theophilus felt relief flood through his chest. "That's all I'm asking." Chibuzor extended his hand slowly. For a moment, Theophilus simply stared at it. Then he shook it. Not as a businessman, not as a billionaire, but as a man meeting his son for the first real time. Behind the door, Mama Enkem watched quietly. Tears filled her tired eyes, because the future she thought her daughter would never see was finally beginning. And though the road ahead would not be simple, the truth had finally opened the door to something none of them had expected. A second chance.
Life often teaches us that the truth does not always arrive when we expect it. Sometimes it waits quietly in the shadows of our past, hidden behind misunderstandings, pride, or decisions made by others. For 13 years, Chibuzor Okafor
pushed a garbage cart through the streets of Lagos, believing his father had abandoned him. And for 13 years, Theophilus Ugwu built one of Africa's most successful companies, believing the woman he loved had disappeared from his life forever. Both of them were living incomplete stories, not because they lacked love, but because the truth had been stolen from them. What this story reminds us is that silence can wound generations. When powerful people hide the truth, the consequences often fall on those with the least power to defend themselves. But it also reminds us of something hopeful. The truth has a strange way of surviving, even after years of silence, even after people try to bury it.
And when it finally surfaces, it can begin something powerful, healing. Not instant healing, not perfect healing, but a chance to rebuild what was broken, a chance to turn strangers into family again. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share your thoughts. Where are you watching from today? And what time is it in your country right now? Your comments help build a global community of people who believe in justice, compassion, and second chances. And if you enjoy emotional stories like this, stories about truth, family, and unexpected hope, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who believes that even the deepest wounds can one day heal.
Because sometimes all it takes to change a life is the courage to finally face the truth.